And I think we have to think about, who gets to create those technologies, who gets to decide what we see and what we don't see when we have opaque algorithms and things like that.
She is Larissa Rhodes, Head of Creative Development and Producer at Exposure Labs, who develops and produces projects that are socially motivated and environmentally conscious. Now she is in a conversation in the World Press Freedom Conference 2020, where content regulation in digital age is a big issue. The digital age has introduced an increased spread in misinformation, electoral interference, and terrorist activity. This podcast is about the impact of content regulation on media and journalism and working towards of human rights.
Behind this amplification of disinformation, there is design choices made by platforms. It's choices made by human engineers, and there's maybe a real conversation to have about these design choices.
In this part of the conversation, it's very important to highlight the abuse of data, like in Cambridge Analytica, or how social media are dealing with this situation.
Now we have a shared truth of the breakdown of truth can hopefully help us get to a state where we can recognize that we need to figure out ways where these platforms are acting as de facto governments. There is a nuanced approach to how regulation of these platforms needs to be done, because when you start to think about how the internet is, there is no nuance in tweets and posts and things like that. This has become a human rights issue, and human rights issues deserve the attention and the detail.
That's why Alexandra Walden, Global Policy Lead for Human Rights and Free Expression for Google, explains how this issue works in that company.
Our approach and the approach itself is designed in alignment with international human rights norms to make sure that we are removing things that are harmful and that incite violence in the world, but at the same time allowing space for differing opinions even when those things are offensive.
But this problem is not only a public debate. What happened with private? Delphine Helgand, she's a lead reporter who works in a group on Infodemic Forum, explains the context of this situation.
Most of the time forgets the importance of disinformation spreading on WhatsApp and Telegram and Facebook Messenger and so on. And it's really critical, as actually we count the users and the messages sent by billions. I think in a month or even in a day, there's around 50 billion messages sent on WhatsApp. And actually, such closed messaging systems are a primary source of information in countries like Brazil, India, or even Spain. So it is critical to really take them into consideration. And it's even more complex because, of course, we're talking about closed messaging system, which means that initially they are made for private exchange, private conversation. It's just that we enter in a blurred line of public-private space, because when you have groups, for example, on Telegram's groups can include 200,000 people. Is it still a private conversation when messages can be forwarded hundreds of times? Is it still a private conversation?
That's why the word regulation is important. And if we want to explore more, there are two perspectives. One is, how do we protect the space that is actually available for public debate? For example, governments around the world are putting extraordinary pressure on the platforms to take down content that is merely critical of government or even extremist. According to David Kay, clinical professor of law at the University of California and also member of a global network initiative, this is why we have to think about it.
So there's a lot of pressure on the companies to basically have an impact on, your users in Egypt, in France, in Singapore, in Myanmar, you name it. So that's one part of the puzzle that needs to be considered.
But this debate is not ending here. There are also another mechanisms like self-regulation and in some of the platforms or Democracy Information Project for social networks or the Democracy and Information Project.
Platform governance itself. And that poses a whole different set of issues. And I think that as we look ahead, I think 2021 is really going to be the year in which platform governance is a global conversation. It's going to start in Brussels, but it's going to be a complicated world of government regulation that hopefully won't get into content regulation per se. It will get into competition. It will get into the business model issues. It will get into transparency and accountability. But there will also be other mechanisms, self-regulation, like the Facebook Oversight Board, and also other, hopefully, cross-industry platforms. So I think there will be a lot of activity that we'll see in the coming year that will really focus the debate in a lot of ways.
But that's also a big deal that we have to implement inside the companies. But it means to respect the laws of the countries where they do business, and at the same time make sure that they are maintaining their commitment to international human rights standards. This is Alexandra Walden again from Google.
Where necessary, we restrict content, illegal content, in that particular jurisdiction, and it remains available elsewhere on the site globally. That's the difference between when we apply our global policies versus when we are complying with local law. Illegal content versus content that violates our policies. And that combination is one that I think we continue to have a lot of discussion about with all of the stakeholders in the space. But what it means is that we are able to respect the laws of the countries where we do business, while at the same time doing our best to make sure that we are maintaining our commitments to international human rights standards.
Is it time to invent a new model of regulation?
The idea is to have a transparency about the 4 core functions of the platforms in regards of content moderation, content working, content targeting, and social building influence. The idea is to have transparency about what are the policies that the platform have, how do they implement them, how do their algorithm work, what are the objectives, how do they test them, what kind of data do they store about the users, how do they sell them, how do they use them, what kind of human rights impact assessment the platform should do before introducing a new policy, a new product. How can they involve more the civil society in this human rights impact assessment? So that's kind of an overview of the transparency requirements that we looked at.
And with transparency, the best part here is to put into the conversation how to educate the audience in this topic. She is Larissa Rhodes from Exposure Labs.
I think there's a need for education and awareness as a result of wanting people to better understand how the platforms function, really what kind of data is collected on you for what purposes, and having a better understanding also as how your own content can be used, how other people are using content, whether that is foreign actors, really the kind of information ecosystems we're operating in right now.
There are so many questions that we have at the end of this conversation. This is just the beginning. What can we do to protect freedom of expression with this regulation? Who defines what content is dangerous and should be deleted? What is the role of fact-checkers here? I'm Sara Trejos, member of Youth Newsroom. Thanks for listening.